Hello, Southold. We are joined now by candidate for New York State Assembly, Rona Smith. Thank you for joining us today, Ms. Smith.
It's really a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
Okay, now before we get started, could you share with us little details about you, like your background? What do you find most important about your campaign, just stuff about your background?
Well, I think one of the interesting things about me is, I'm an older candidate. I'm 73, which is, considerably older than most candidates. And I've had a long and varied background. In the beginning, I, graduated from high school, not sure what I wanted to do. And I wanted to mention that because I think it's okay not knowing what you want to do when you get out of high school. And I went to college I went to Queens College, mostly at night. And I went there partly because it was free. And it was an opportunity to kind of hedge my bets and see what I would like. And when I graduated from college, I got married immediately. And I started teaching junior high school English. I was an English major. And I loved it. And it was such a great feeling of success to work with kids who were reluctant to read and turning them on to my passion for books and for reading and for stories and for writing. And I did that for about 2 years, and I received a fellowship to get a master's degree at NYU, which I did. I got a master's in linguistics, and shortly thereafter, I got a PhD. I also got a fellowship for my PhD at NYU. So I became an academic, from a reluctant student to an academic. And in the years since then, that was 1979, in the years since then, I've been involved in business. I've built a very successful business from scratch, and which I shepherded for about 15, 20 years. And I decided that I wanted to have an MBA after my experience in business. And I was accepted at Columbia Business School, which is a very competitive thing, and I was 52 at the time. So that was really an achievement. And I went to school with 27-year-olds, which was an incredible learning experience for them and for me. And so I have worked in business. I've been an academic. I've done many things. I've been very active in Southold Town, particularly with affordable housing, because I know that if you don't have stable housing, you really can't accomplish things. You can't set goals for yourself other than just paying your bills and worrying about taking care of your family. So those issues are very important to me, and I've done that as a volunteer, and I try to be as nonpartisan as possible. My campaign materials don't have my party, which happens to be Democratic, but I don't think that people necessarily should vote by party. I think they should vote for the person, and they should look to the person's history and skills as a way to make their decision.
So, your opponent, Assemblyman Palumbo, has held his seat for 5 years now. What made you decide you wanted to challenge him?
Well, day one of this, I never expected to be a candidate. I've never been a political candidate before. And as I say, I'm mostly nonpartisan in my day-to-day activities. So the Southold Democratic Committee came to me, and I think mostly because of the activities that I've pursued in Southold, and asked me if I would run. And I was hesitant, of course, to be a candidate, and it just seemed such a way-out idea to me. And I looked at his background and his history, and in spite of what he says, he has a very weak history. He mentions 2 initiatives a lot, but they are not on his assembly page. They are not legislation that he sponsored. He has not spearheaded anything important. You can go to the New York State Assembly, which has web pages for all the members, and it shows their primary sponsored legislation. And the things that he mentions at all the campaign events that I'm at with him are not on that page because they are things that were sponsored by other people. And so he has a really weak history, and he has not spearheaded, been in the leadership position of anything for our district. And it means that we're not getting as much as we could be getting from Albany. And I think I have to pursue that for us. It fits right into the direction in which I've moved.
Okay, so how do you think statewide politics affect the nation?
I think, statewide politics have traditionally taken a back seat to federal legislation, federal activity. I think, and this is certainly a partisan opinion, but I think that what's happening in our federal government is blockading a lot of people from the opportunities they need to have, like health care. Student loans are a disaster, which I can go into in depth. All of these things have become problems for people in their day-to-day lives, people in New York State. And I think that the State Assembly provides an opportunity to go after some of these issues and to make them state laws. For example, we have very strong gun protections in our state, and the federal government is now working to allow people who can carry a concealed weapon across state borders to be able to enter New York State with those weapons. We don't want that to happen. So there are things that we can block in the Assembly and the Senate, in the state in general, that will help people. We can move toward a Medicare program or a single-payer program. We just have to move toward it. We're not going to accomplish everything in a day, but we've got to keep our emissions standards high. We've got to protect the environment. We can't let these standards that people worked very hard for 20 years just crumble and fall by the side of the road. You might notice that my yard signs, the green ones, are paper. They are cardboard and they're, biodegradable. And so I'm proud of that. I'm proud of having high standards and standards that I can bring to the state to protect people. That's what standards are for.
Now, young people are being driven away from the east end of Long Island because of the lack of high-paying professional jobs. What ways do you believe you could help bring jobs to the North and South Forks?
I think that's a really good question. Jobs are everything. Many people who live here work 2 jobs. There's no question. I mean, almost everybody that I know works 2 jobs because they're not earning enough to be able to support a family here. Long Island is very expensive. And I will cite a statistic that might surprise you, that in 1970, 86% of the people from 18 to 34-year-olds own their own homes. 86%, and the number in 2016 was 20%. So the direction that we're moving in is people, even into their 40s, have to live with their parents. And frequently, it's something that keeps them from marrying, keeps them from having children, keeps them from setting up their own household, which inhibits growth. It inhibits setting goals. So that's one aspect, important aspect. But in terms of jobs, there are several things. Even healthcare, for example. If you expand the number of people who are covered by health insurance, you need more practitioners. There's no question that the existing doctors cannot meet the demands of more patients. So what are doctors naturally doing? They are hiring physician's assistants and nurse practitioners. And these are things that people, even with a licensed practical nurse credential, could aspire to. These are high-paying jobs. They pay in the neighborhood of $100,000 a year. The other thing is we have to look at infrastructure. We have to build better infrastructure, like for telephones, for example. How often do you have drop calls on your phone particularly in Southold. And we need to build infrastructure. We need to bring money here to build infrastructure. And that's really, really important. The other thing is I think we need to bring BOCES here more, because one area of high-paying jobs are things like plumbers and electricians and carpenters, and we don't respect those jobs, and we should. We need to. And those people are earning living wages. Many of them have their own businesses, and they're doing really well, and we act as though the only way to go in life is toward college. And it isn't right for everybody, and it isn't necessarily a source of earning a living. So that's pretty much the jobs picture a little bit.
So, Long Island is an epicenter of the opioid crisis that grips the nation. What have you done, and what are you going to do to remedy this crisis?
Well, it's a very, very serious problem. You might not even know that across the country this year, more people died from opioid overdoses than died of AIDS in the height of the AIDS crisis. And remember, you probably don't remember, but it was a huge, huge awakening. People were really alarmed. I don't think people are alarmed enough about the opioid crisis. And I think one of the things is that many people who are addicted don't have proper medical insurance to get long-term treatment. It's sort of patch them up and send them out, and it's not enough. They need to have long-range treatment. Addiction is a serious physical thing. It isn't something you can just say to somebody, stop, and they'll stop. Many people would like to stop and find they can't. So it's something we need to address with treatment and longer range treatment.
What would you do to get more young people to vote and take action in our elections?
That's a really tough one, because I don't know. I'm curious what you two think. This school seems so optimistic to me from the moment you walk in the front door. But I think a lot of young people feel very cynical, and they don't believe that any politician could possibly change anything for them or their families. And so they just think, voting is like a fly on the nose. And honestly, I think if we don't exercise our power to vote, then the government can do anything it wants with us. We really have to exercise that power. In the beginning, I said to people working with me on my campaign, I said, let's have a pizza party, so we can get 18-year-olds to vote. And they fell over laughing. When I scraped them off the floor, they said, that's not the way. And so we are doing social media. We do have a digital campaign that we just started on Monday, which will run through election days, so you'll get pop-ups for the campaign. But it's really difficult, and I think the main thing is that you have to communicate optimism. If you don't communicate optimism, 18-year-olds will not vote. They just won't. They will just soldier on. Many of them are facing some very, very difficult tasks, decisions about student loans and where to go to college and how to earn a living. And they're not paying attention because they don't believe politicians will make a dent in any of those things for them. So they sit it out. I hope this year is different, because I think this is a particularly important election. I think we have to send a message that we are involved, all of us, and we care, and we're watching.
So the environment is a big concern among young people and many other citizens here on the North Fork. If you were selected, what would you do to protect our fragile environment here on the North Fork and beyond?
Well, it's really a biggie. There are so many sort of discrete issues that make up the whole. But let's start with water. On Monday, I had a sit-down with Al Krupski, who has been doing a fantastic job as a Suffolk County legislator. And he has been working very closely with the Suffolk County Board of Health, who are the people who regulate water treatment locally. And they are really making inroads in alternative systems because we are the largest town in the state that still has cesspool systems. And so the task is to wean people off those, get them some subsidies so they can afford to pay for these systems, which are not cheap. They are about $20,000 per system, but you're going to have that forevermore, and it means the nitrogen won't be leaching into the water, killing fish, etc. So we have to take things one baby step at a time. But I must say, as much as I admire Al Krupski, I was very impressed that he endorsed me. He endorsed my candidacy because he believes we're on the same page. And he believes that if I were in the assembly, we could work together to solve some of these issues. I don't see the big picture issues getting solved with the current incumbent. I just don't see it.
Now, gun safety is one of your leading issues. How do you think you can help prevent gun violence?
I think we have very strong and very good laws for the most part in New York State. We've got to keep out that concealed carry reciprocity, which is what it's called. You know, in other words, if they can do it in their state, they should be able to carry it across the border into our state. We've got to keep that out. It's really important for people to have licensing that takes time, that gives them a pause. Anybody who's a hunter or wants a gun for some recreational use or even for protection can wait 3 days. We need to make sure there's a pause. Pausing helps you with so many things if you pause before you do an action. So pausing in gun licensing is important. You know, the person who just killed a whole lot of people in Pittsburgh had 11 registered handguns. And part of it is that he had a semi-automatic gun. And so did the shooter in Parkland, Florida. And these semi-automatic weapons are really not for hunting or protection. They are weapons of war. We shouldn't allow them in anybody's hands. They're just not appropriate. And it would save lives if a shooter went into a bang, bang, bang instead of you know. So the rapid firing thing is a really serious thing. And I think, since you are students, and I think about those Parkland students, I think about how noble their task is and how impressed I am with how articulate they are. And I'm really scandalized with how they've been treated, that they've had threats, that they've been called actors, that they've been denigrated in so many ways is really a sad, sad thing in our society. And people believe these things. They hear things, they lurch onto it, and then they believe it. Like people saying that the little kids who got shot in Sandy Hook, that these parents were making it up. I mean, that is so horrible and so painful to those parents. I just think we've got to be much better readers and receptors of media than we are now. It's got to be a key focal point for us.
Now, if we could just circle back real quick to earlier, you mentioned this whole story about your pathway to entering college, and something I want to touch upon was with student loans now. It's becoming a crisis.
Yes, it is.
So how do you think you could help adjust and alleviate some of the stress and pain that's associated with student loans?
Right. Well, there's a very strong principle here that you would adhere to in any financial situation. There usually is a means test for a loan. In other words, if you go to borrow $100,000 for a mortgage on a house, they look at your salary, your income, your other expenses before they decide to give it to you. the decisions about student loans are really not related to your means to pay it back. So people get into trouble from day one. One of the things we have to have is any school, any and every post-high school school has to post the salaries of average graduates so that when you enter a school, you know, you have an idea. If you're going to be an engineer, this is what you'll earn. This is how much you'll be able to afford to pay back after you buy food and pay rent. But that doesn't happen now. So we need objective advice. People are not getting objective advice. And the only advice they're getting are from the lenders themselves. And this is true even when people are paying back their loans. One of the reasons that people are paying back loans for so long after they graduate from college is that when they have trouble paying, they're always encouraged to lower their loan payment by spreading it out over time. And what does that do? That earns more interest for the lender. So we need to mandate in New York State that only objective advice is available to a student and to his or her parents, because parents don't know these things sometimes. They feel like it takes the burden off them by, allowing their kids to go to college, and they wouldn't otherwise be able to afford it. But it becomes an albatross. People are paying these loans into their 40s. And I've heard lots of stories about parents and grandparents who co-sign for these loans, paying them back in old age. I mean, it's really a national scandal, and it hasn't been addressed at all, really. So we have to get objective advice for young people and for their families. So they go in knowing what they're doing, knowing what they're taking on and their possible ability to pay it back. And that's if they graduate. If they don't graduate, they're still going to have debt for the period of time they were in school, and that's going to be even harder to pay back. So we have a real crisis. And of course, the for-profit schools are another whole problem. And the federal government has recently eased up the rules on those schools. So if we had this mandate to present to us average earnings for graduates, they would be tripped up on that. I've heard that some people who go to these schools, these for-profit schools, and don't check into them, they graduate, they go out for a job interview, they think they have a bachelor's degree, and employers say, this is worthless. It's worthless. And now you have all this student loan debt, and you have nothing to use to earn a living. So it's sad.
Thank you again for joining us today. If you have any final remarks, feel free to say them.
Vote. Just get out and vote if you are able to do it. And if you're not old enough to vote, make sure your parents, your siblings, your aunts, your uncles, you've got to get on the phone and make sure that everybody votes, not just for me, but vote in the elections so that people can see that people really care about what's happening in the country. We have to make sure that we're counted. So get people you know to vote. Thank you. Thank you for having me. Good questions.
Our pleasure.
Thank you.
Okay, so there we have it. Rona Smith is running for Assemblyman in the 2nd District of New York. Make sure to come out and vote. I'm Sabrina Basil, she's Rona Smith, and he's Anakin Mignon. Thank you very much.